An old woman took in two freezing dogs. The next morning, police surrounded her house. The wind howled like a wounded animal, tearing across the white wasteland of a rural valley. Snow fell in thick sheets, swallowing the forest, the fences, even the outline of the lonely cabin that crouched against the storm. Inside, an old woman sat hunched in her wooden rocker, the fire's glow licking her weathered face. She had grown used to silence, silence of long winters, silence of years lived without a husband or children, but on this night, silence cracked. Through the roar of the blizzard came a sound so faint she thought it was her imagination. A whimper, thin, desperate, almost swallowed by the storm. She froze, her brittle hands gripping the armrest, listening. The sound came again. This time she knew it was real. Her heart pounding, she shuffled to the door, every joint stiff with age. When she opened it, the world outside burst into the cabin, snow stinging her cheeks, icy wind clawing at her breath. But she saw them, two tiny shapes trembling against the drift, their fur crusted with ice. German shepherd pups, ribs showing beneath soaked coats, eyes wide and pleading. They tried to bark, but only coughed, their bodies too weak to make a sound. The woman's throat tightened. Without thinking, she stooped, though the movement sent pain shooting through her back, and gathered them into her arms. The pups pressed against her chest, cold as stones, shaking violently. Tears spilled down her wrinkled face. "Come inside, little ones," she whispered, pushing the door shut with her hip. "You're safe now." She placed them by the hearth, wrapped them in an old wool blanket, and fed them scraps from her pantry. Slowly, the pups revived, their eyes softening, their tails giving faint thumps against the floor. For the first time in years, the cabin felt alive. The old woman did not know that by opening her door, she had opened her fate. She thought she had rescued two lost creatures. By morning, she would discover that these were no ordinary strays, and that her act of kindness would bring police cars roaring through the snow to surround her home. Snow still blanketed the valley when dawn bled into the horizon, soft light filtering through frost-coated windows. The cabin creaked as the storm loosened its grip, and inside, the fire smoldered low, casting an amber glow across the walls of hand-cut timber. The old woman sat near the hearth, wrapped in her faded shawl, staring at the two small creatures now curled tightly against each other on the woolen rug. Their chests rose and fell in fragile rhythm, tiny noses twitching as dreams carried them far from the blizzard that had almost claimed them. Her name was Margaret Ellison, though in the valley most simply called her the widow on Black Pine Ridge. She had lived alone for over 2 decades, since the day her husband's heart failed on a logging trail. Their only child, a son, had left years earlier to find work in the city and never returned. Letters dried up, visits ceased, and she no longer expected a knock on her door. Time had hollowed her home into silence, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the sigh of winter winds. Margaret had not planned on company. Age had slowed her hands, stiffened her legs, and made her wary of burdens. Yet, as she watched the pups huddle closer to the embers, something softened in her chest, a warmth she thought had been buried forever. Their presence filled the room like music, faint but undeniable, and she felt her own heart beating in a rhythm that did not belong to loneliness. The pups stirred, blinking up at her. One, slightly larger, had a streak of darker fur down its back, ears already sharp despite its youth. The other had a faint scar near its muzzle, a mark too deliberate for chance. When they tried to stand, their legs wobbled, but soon they tottered toward her. The larger pup pressed its head against her knee. The smaller pawed at her hand, as if demanding attention. Margaret chuckled, the sound foreign to her own ears. "Well now," she murmured, her voice trembling, "seems I've been claimed." She reached for the tin bowl, poured warm milk, and watched them lap eagerly, their tongues clicking softly against the metal. Drops clung to their whiskers, and when they finished, they licked her fingers with gratitude so pure it almost broke her. For years, she had convinced herself she had nothing left to give. But here, in her drafty little cabin, two pairs of eyes reflected something she thought she'd lost: purpose. Outside, the storm's aftermath stretched across the land. Fir trees bent under heavy snow, the forest muffled into silence. In the distance, frozen hills glistened in weak sunlight. Margaret's cabin, though small, stood like a stubborn relic against time, its cedar roof patched by her own hands, its walls lined with jars of preserves and shelves of hand-knit blankets. Survival here had always been an act of quiet defiance. That night, as shadows thickened once more, she set another log on the fire and lay back in her rocker. The pups, now fed and drowsy, scrambled onto her lap. Their warmth spread through her thin frame, their tiny heartbeats steady against her ribs. One yawned, showing pink gums and baby teeth before curling into the crook of her arm. The other rested its chin on her shawl, eyes half closed, yet vigilant. For the first time in many winters, Margaret did not feel afraid of the silence. She let her eyes close, the crackle of the fire and the weight of her new companions lulling her into a fragile peace. Yet beneath the peace, unease stirred. Twice during the night, the pups awoke, their ears pricking at sounds she could not hear. They barked sharply, then whimpered, pressing close to her legs. Margaret shushed them, stroking their backs, though inside she wondered, what did they sense in the darkness? When she drifted into dreams, she saw flashes of men in uniforms, voices raised in command, beams of light cutting through trees. The images unsettled her, but she told herself it was only the remnants of the storm playing tricks on her mind. By morning, the valley would answer her doubts, and Margaret Ellison, the forgotten widow of Black Pine Ridge, would find her solitude pierced not just by two half-frozen pups, but by the weight of a truth that had followed them across the snow. The fire had burned down to glowing coals when Margaret stirred awake. For a moment she thought she was still dreaming, until she felt a gentle weight on her lap. One of the pups had climbed onto her while she slept, its small body curled tight against her belly, its nose buried in the folds of her shawl. The other sat at her feet, staring at her with dark, watchful eyes as if guarding her from some unseen danger. Margaret blinked, then laughed softly, a laugh that sounded rusty from disuse. "You've taken to me, haven't you?" she whispered. The pup in her lap wriggled at the sound of her voice, and for the first time in years she felt something stir that was more than routine survival. She felt wanted. She set a pot of porridge to cook, the scent of oats filling the cabin, and broke off a piece of bread from the loaf she'd baked days earlier. Crumbling it into their dish, she added milk and set it on the floor. Both pups pounced eagerly, their tails thumping against the planks. Margaret watched them eat, with a smile that softened her wrinkled face, her eyes shimmering with tears she didn't bother to hide. When they finished, the larger pup sat back on its haunches and tilted its head, studying her with uncanny focus. The smaller licked her hand insistently, then pressed its paw onto her knee. The gesture was so deliberate it startled her. She felt her throat tighten. "You know, don't you, that I needed you as much as you needed me." The morning stretched into afternoon. Margaret busied herself with chores she had long performed in silence, chopping wood, hauling water, patching the firewood box. This time, she had company. The pups followed her clumsily, stumbling over their own feet, tumbling into the snow outside the cabin door. Each time she bent down to scoop them up, her old bones protested, yet her heart lifted. For once, the ache in her joints seemed less cruel, softened by the warmth of two shadows always at her heels. When she paused to rest, they climbed into her lap together, pressing against her ribs as if afraid she might disappear if they let go. She stroked their fur, still coarse with ice melt, but already beginning to shine in the firelight, and closed her eyes, listening to the steady rhythm of their breaths. She could feel their tiny hearts beating against her palm. Later that evening, she took out her late husband's old coat, the one she could never bring herself to throw away. It smelled faintly of cedar and smoke, and as she spread it on the floor near the fire, both pups immediately claimed it. They nestled into its folds, sighing with contentment, as though sensing it carried a history of safety. Margaret sat watching them, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She realized she was crying again, not from grief this time, but from a fragile joy she hadn't dared imagine. Hours slipped by as she hummed a tune she hadn't sung in decades, the lullaby her mother used to murmur when nights grew long and winters cruel. The pups' ears twitched at the sound, their bodies relaxing even deeper into sleep. For Margaret, the song was both prayer and confession, a way of telling the empty cabin and herself that perhaps she had not been left behind completely. When she finally banked the fire and prepared for bed, both pups scrambled after her, refusing to remain by the hearth. She let them climb under the quilt, their little bodies radiating heat against her thin frame. In the silence of the cabin, she felt their steady breaths mingle with hers. And for the first time in years, Margaret Ellison drifted into sleep not as a woman alone, but as part of a small, fragile family. What she did not yet know was that this bond, sealed in the quiet of a winter night, would soon be tested. The pups' instincts, the same instincts that had kept them alive long enough to reach her door, were already sharpening, and before long, the loyalty they offered her would reveal its true weight. The night pressed down heavy, thick with silence, and Margaret found herself awake long after the pups had drifted into slumber. Their soft breaths filled the cabin, a sound so steady that it almost drowned out the whisper of her own memories. But memory has a way of breaking through the strongest walls. She sat in her rocker, staring at the fire as the past uncoiled from the corners of her mind. She had been 19 when she married Thomas Ellison. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with laughter that carried across fields. Together, they had built this very cabin with their own hands, log by log, while dreams of children and long summers filled their heads. And for a time, life had been exactly as she imagined. Their son was born on a spring morning when lilacs bloomed outside the window. She still remembered the weight of him in her arms, the way Thomas wept with joy. But joy is fragile. One winter, Thomas left before dawn to fell timber for the mill. He never returned. The men said his heart had given out, that the weight of the axe had been too much. They found him sprawled in the snow, his eyes open, to the gray sky. Margaret buried him herself, the ground frozen so hard it broke her shovel. For weeks after, she swore she could still hear his footsteps on the porch, his voice calling her name through the trees. Her son grew, restless and eager for more than the valley could offer. At 18, he left with a suitcase and a promise to write. The first letters came often, full of hope and city noise. Then they slowed. Then they stopped. Margaret waited by the mailbox for years, her heart tightening with each silent season. Eventually, she stopped walking the road altogether. The silence became her companion. It aged her quicker than years ever could. Her hands grew stiff, her hair silvered, and her heart sank deeper into its cage. She told herself she was finished with love, with connection. The cabin became her tomb long before the earth would claim her. And yet, these pups. She glanced at them now, curled on her husband's old coat, their tiny bodies pressed together as though refusing to let the world steal them apart. Something about their fragile closeness pulled her backward into that day at the grave, the day she lowered Thomas into the ground and swore she would never love again. Love had seemed a cruel trick, a flame too easily snuffed. But here it was again, fragile and insistent, burning in the eyes of two half-frozen strays. Margaret did not know their story, but she sensed it in the way they startled at every sound, the way their heads snapped toward the door as though expecting enemies. They were not ordinary. The scar along the smaller one's muzzle, the sharpness in the gaze of the larger, it all spoke of lives already marked by struggle. What she could not know was that only a day before, these pups had been far from her quiet ridge. Born from a line bred for discipline, they had been placed in the care of a police training program. Still young, their instincts were raw, but sharp. They were learning to track scents, to obey commands, to become partners to officers who trusted them with their lives. But when the blizzard swept through, cutting visibility to nothing, they became separated from their handler. The storm swallowed their cries. By the time night fell, they were alone in the woods, tiny paws bleeding on ice, muzzles coated in frost. They had followed instinct, searching for warmth, for safety. It led them to her cabin door. They did not know her name, but they knew kindness when it touched them. Margaret saw echoes of her own tragedy in them. Just as the storm had stolen Thomas from her, it had nearly stolen them from the world. Just as abandonment had hollowed her years, separation had marked their tiny frames. She reached down, running her hand gently over their backs, whispering as though to ghosts, "You're safe now. I won't let the cold take you." The pups stirred at her voice. One crawled into her lap, pressing its nose into her chest, and she held it as she had once held her infant son, cradling fragile life against the storm of the world. She realized then that grief had not killed her ability to love. It had only buried it, waiting for a night like this to bring it back. The hours crept by, memories and reality blurred, weaving Thomas's laughter with the pup's small yelps, her son's vanished footsteps with the patter of tiny paws on wooden floors. For the first time in decades, she felt the sharp edge of sorrow ease into something softer, an understanding that love was not gone, only transformed. Still, a shadow lingered. When the pups snapped awake at the sound of shifting snow outside, Margaret felt her own heart jolt. They growled low, bodies taut, ears pricked. She peered through the frosted window, but saw nothing but moonlight on snowdrifts. Yet their reaction was too sharp, too knowing to dismiss. Margaret tightened the shawl around her shoulders and whispered into the silence, "What have you brought with you?" The fire hissed, the pups settled back down, but unease threaded through the room. Margaret stroked their fur, trying to calm herself as much as them. She had no idea that her own sorrow, finally given voice, was about to be bound to theirs by a truth that would crash into her world with the force of boots crunching snow. The morning broke sharp and brittle, the kind of winter dawn where the air itself seemed carved from glass. Frost etched patterns across the window panes, and the cabin walls groaned as if straining against the cold. Margaret rose stiffly, fed the fire, and set water to boil. The pups, now more lively, bounded clumsily across the room, nipping at each other's ears, their tails wagging in bursts of joy. She smiled, letting herself believe just for a moment that perhaps life had turned a corner. But then came the sound. At first it was faint, a low hum threading through the silence. Margaret frowned, leaning closer to the frosted glass. The hum grew, became a rumble, then the sharp grind of tires against snow. She felt her breath catch. No one ever came up the ridge in winter. The road was nearly impassable, yet now engines, plural, were climbing toward her home. The pups froze, ears snapping upright. A deep growl rose in their throats, so sudden and fierce it startled her. They darted to the door, barking with sharp, disciplined bursts that made her blood run cold. These were not the clumsy cries of frightened strays. These were warnings. Margaret's heart pounded as she pulled the curtain aside. Through the pale light she saw them, black and white cruisers nosing through the snow, their lights flashing red and blue against the wide expanse. Doors slammed, heavy boots crunched, voices carried, clipped, and commanding. The valley, her sanctuary, suddenly swarmed with authority. She staggered back, pressing a hand to her chest. "Dear Lord," she whispered. The pups' barking intensified. One planted itself before the door, hackles raised, while the other dashed to the window, scratching at the frost as though to confront the intruders. Margaret tried to hush them, but their energy was electric, unstoppable. Then came the knock, hard, urgent, rattling the door on its hinges. "Police!" a voice barked. "Open up!" Margaret's knees nearly gave way. She fumbled with the latch, her mind spinning. What could they want with her? What had she done but take in two half-frozen animals? The door swung open before she could answer. Cold air rushed in, along with 3 officers in heavy coats, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Their eyes swept the room, sharp and searching, until they landed on the pups. The shift was immediate. Relief flickered across one man's face. Another exhaled heavily, muttering, "Thank God." Margaret stood rooted, trembling. "What is this? Why are you here?" One officer, tall with a grizzled beard, stepped forward. His voice was firm but not unkind. "Ma'am, those aren't just strays. They're part of our K-9 training program. They went missing yesterday during the storm. We've been searching the ridge all night." Margaret's breath caught. She looked down at the pups, who now stood at her side, pressed close to her legs, their bodies taut with tension. They did not run to the officers. They did not wag their tails. Instead, they stayed rooted to her, as if she were their anchor. They came to my door," Margaret stammered. "They were freezing. I couldn't just—" Her voice broke. "You saved them," the officer said, his tone softening. "Without you, they wouldn't have survived the night." But his reassurance did little to calm her racing heart. For even as he spoke, Margaret saw something deeper in the way the officers moved. Urgency, almost desperation. Radios crackled. Orders were exchanged. This was no simple recovery mission. One of the pups barked again, low and guttural, eyes fixed on the snow beyond the cruisers. Margaret followed its gaze and saw nothing but drifting flakes. Yet the dog's reaction made her shiver. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice quivering. "Why surround my house for two little dogs?" The officer hesitated, then shook his head. "It's complicated, ma'am. All I can say is these pups are more than valuable. They're critical. They're trained to sense things most wouldn't notice. If they came here, it wasn't by accident." Margaret swallowed hard, clutching the edge of the table to steady herself. The pups pressed tighter against her shins, refusing to leave her side. In their dark eyes, she saw not just loyalty, but something fiercer, something that bound them to her beyond food or warmth. The knock of fate had come, and it had come wearing a badge. The cabin felt smaller than ever, its walls closing in under the weight of flashing lights and uniformed men. Margaret clutched the table, her heart hammering while the pups bristled at her feet. The officers moved carefully, speaking into radios, scanning the tree line beyond the ridge as though danger lingered just out of sight. Then it happened. From the woods came a sharp crack, not the sound of falling snow, but something harder, sharper, a gunshot. The officers spun toward the sound, hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Margaret gasped, stumbling back against the wall. The pups moved before anyone else. With a burst of energy far too fierce for their small frames, they darted to the door, barking in rapid, clipped bursts that echoed like commands. Their bodies shook with tension, ears pinned forward, eyes burning with focus. These were no helpless creatures now. Instinct and training had ignited something primal. "Get down!" one officer shouted, pushing Margaret toward the floor. The pups stayed upright, their eyes locked on the tree line. Another crack split the air, and this time a bullet smacked into the cabin's outer wall, splintering wood into dust. Margaret cried out, curling her arms around her head. The larger pup lunged forward, pressing itself against her chest, shielding her with its tiny body. The smaller planted its paws on her lap, growling so fiercely the sound rattled in her bones. They would not leave her, even as danger closed in. The officers returned fire, their shouts mixing with the barking, the chaos tearing through the once quiet valley. Margaret trembled, clutching the pups to her chest. In the blur of panic, one thought seared into her mind. They weren't just protecting her out of instinct. They had chosen her. "Ma'am!" the bearded officer barked over the noise. "We've got to move you out of here, now!" But Margaret could not stand. Her body shook, her legs weak, her age betraying her. She tried, but her knees buckled. The pups yelped, circling her, one pawing at her shawl, the other tugging at her sleeve with its teeth, as if trying to drag her upright. "Go!" she cried to them, tears streaming down her face. "Don't stay for me!" But they did not go. They pressed closer, their small frames trembling, yet unyielding. In their eyes, she saw it, unyielding devotion, the kind of loyalty she had thought only existed in memory. She had once held a husband who promised forever, once nursed a son who swore he'd return. Both had slipped away, yet here, in her darkest moment, two half-frozen orphans of the storm stood fast, declaring in their own wordless way, "We will not leave you." Another shot rang out, closer this time, and Margaret cried out. The pups erupted, their barking sharper, fiercer, echoing into the trees. And in the sudden silence that followed, The gunfire ceased. Whoever had haunted the ridge slipped back into the shadows, chased by the fury of voices and the courage of two small guardians. The officers moved quickly, surrounding Margaret, securing the perimeter, radios crackling with updates. But she heard none of it. Her entire world had shrunk to the weight of fur pressed against her, the thundering of two tiny hearts that had stood between her and death. When at last the danger ebbed and the cabin filled only with the hiss of the fire and the soft murmur of voices, Margaret dared to lift her head. The pups gazed up at her, eyes bright, muzzles streaked with soot and snow. She stroked their heads, her hands trembling. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice raw. "You saved me when no one else would." In that moment, it no longer mattered that they belonged to another world, that uniforms would soon take them back to training grounds and commands she could not give. For this one night, in this one fragile heartbeat of winter, they were hers, and she was theirs. The storm had passed, leaving behind a valley hushed under morning light. Smoke curled gently from the cabin's chimney, mingling with the faint scent of gunpowder that still lingered in the air. Margaret sat in her rocker, the pups at her feet, their small bodies finally resting after the night's chaos. Her hands trembled less now, though her heart was still tender, heavy with the weight of what had nearly been lost. The officers finished their sweep, their radios quieting, their shoulders easing. One by one, they stepped back inside to check on her. The bearded officer crouched, his lined face softened with relief. "Ma'am," he said gently, "you've done more than you know. These pups—" He paused, glancing at them as they lifted their heads, alert even in exhaustion. "They're going to be heroes, but tonight they were yours." Margaret nodded, her throat tight. She reached down, cupping each small head in her hands, feeling their warmth soak into her palms. They licked her finger, tails giving faint thumps as if trying to reassure her. "We're still here." When the time came to leave, the officers hesitated, giving her space. She rose slowly, joints aching, and knelt by the door. The pups pressed against her, unwilling to budge. Margaret hugged them both close, burying her face in their fur, breathing in the wild, earthy scent of them. Tears blurred her sight, but she managed to whisper, "Be brave now. The world needs you." They whined softly, resisting as the officers coaxed them toward the waiting vehicles. Even as they were led across the snow, they kept glancing back, ears twitching, paws dragging, as if torn between duty and the old woman who had given them warmth when death had been near. Margaret stood in the doorway, shawl drawn tight, her figure framed by the glow of the fire behind her. She watched until the last cruiser disappeared down the ridge, lights fading into the pale horizon. Then she turned back inside, the cabin suddenly quiet again, but not empty. The echoes of tiny paws, the warmth of loyal bodies pressed against her, still lingered in every corner. For the first time in years, Margaret did not feel forgotten. She felt part of a story larger than her own. The pups had come to her in a storm, and though they had gone, they had left something behind, a reminder that love does not vanish with age, that kindness can ripple outward in ways unseen. She sank into a rocker, closed her eyes, and let the fire's glow wash over her. The world outside was still cold, still harsh, but in her heart, something fragile and bright had been rekindled, because not all heroes wear badges or uniforms. Some arrive on 4 legs, shivering in the snow, leaving paw prints that never fade.